for joining me on the papers on Canal de English broadcast from Douala, Cameroon. My name is Gladys Ambodibang. This morning, we begin with the French daily Info Matin that captions on the Cameroonian writer Patrice Nganang. The paper reports or describes his day two at the Kondengi Maximum Prison. The paper tells us how quarter 11 of the detention center is accommodating the writer, who is known for his provocative and satirical style of writing. He has been accused of death threats, condoning in crime and outrage to the President of the Republic. Read the ambience surrounding his stay at the Kondengi Maximum Prison in today's edition of the French Daily Info Matin. The paper equally informs us how the head of state Paul Biya returns to Cameroon today after taking part in the One Planet Summit that held in Paris, France. The paper says that the head of state, or the summit that brought together other head of states, was aimed at lobbying funds to fight against climate change. The details are found on page 3 of the French Daily Info Matin. Then let's move over to Le Financier d'Afrique, which is equally interested in the fight against climate change and tells us about the proposals of the African heads of states. The paper says the Gabonese president Ali Bongo, who is equally the president of the Committee of African Heads of States on Climate Change, has urged the states concerned to respect their financial commitments. He made the call at the just ended One Planet Summit that held in Paris, France. Page 12 of Le Financier d'Afrique has more on that story. Then the paper also tells us about that Chad has adopted its 2018 state budget that stands at 1,343 billion francs CFA, but tells us that the budget has noticed a deficit of 496 billion francs as compared to the 2017 state budget. Page 11 of Le Financier d'Afrique has more on that story. Then let's talk about Alternance this morning. Alternance tells us, or captions on the Anglophone crisis, and reports that the strategies used by secessionists has been unveiled and their camps dismantled. It equally informs us that the password used by the secessionists on their system, the VPN, has also been retrieved. According to Alternance newspaper, head of state Paul Biya has gone on the offensive just like what he did in the year 2008. Have the details on that on page 2 or page 3 of All Finance newspaper. Then L'Oeil du Sahel, the tri-weekly newspaper, reports that in Kolofata, in the far north region of Cameroon, 10 members of the Boko Haram insurgent group or terrorist sect have given up and have handed themselves over to authorities in that region. You have the details on that on page 3 of L'Oeil du Sahel newspaper, which equally informs us that 191 persons in the Adamawa region have been tested positive for tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS. You have that in today's edition of L'Oeil du Sahel, which again tells us how the Bankim and Shide border in the Bankim and Shide border, that is in the far north region, the borders will soon be open, and you have that in today's edition of L'Oeil du Sahel. And then let's move over to the Guardian Post newspaper, which tells us about the Anglophone crisis. It says security forces and gunmen have clashed in broad daylight in Mamfe in the Manyo division in southwest Cameroon, and it is feared that many died in yesterday's heavy gun fire exchange that lasted for several hours. You have that on page 3 of the Guardian Post newspaper, which again tells us about SDF MPs who raised alarm over plot to assassinate them. You have that on page 3 of the Guardian Post. And again, we have Barrister Nico Hale, who has just wrapped up a 10-day peace mission to the northwest region of Cameroon, that is concerning the Anglophone crisis. You have the details on that in today's edition of the English daily, The Guardian Post. Then the Post Weekender has as main caption the Senate president who gets 2 billion francs CFA for house repairs as poverty rages Cameroonians. You have that on page 2 of the Post newspaper, which again tells us about SDF MPs who rubbishes government's claim of protecting Anglophones. If you want the details on that, then you will read today's edition of the Post newspaper. Then Emergence this morning is interested in Patrice Nganang, who is a Cameroonian writer. The paper questions if Patrice Nganang is a danger to head of state Paul Biya. You have the answers in today's edition of the Emergence newspaper, which sought the opinions of some 11 experts. You have the opinions in this edition of Emergence newspaper. Then the paper tells us about elections at the Cameroon Football Federation FECAFOOT. It says the normalization committee has changed the rules. You have that in today's edition of Emergence, which again tells us about football and says Morocco is ready to host the 2018 African Cup of Nations Championship. The details you have in Emergence newspaper. Then let's talk about the Median newspaper. The Median captions on the new general manager of the stabilization fund, that is the hydrocarbon stabilization fund, and question who is Okie Johnson, though he was appointed as the new general manager in a presidential decree recently. The paper says that Biya positions Nguti in power sharing in the Coupe Maninguba division. You have that in today's edition of the Median Post, which says the appointment of Okie Johnson Do as general manager of the Hydrocarbon Stabilization Fund is arguably the biggest political gift that Paul Biya has given the Nguti people after the Nzo Ekangaki, one-time OAU Secretary General and one-time Special Advisor at the presidency of the Republic, that is under the Biya and Ayijo regime, a minority clan in the Bakosi-dominated Coupe Maninguba division of the Southwest region. The people of Nguti subdivision had virtually been abandoned to themselves by Yaoundé ever since Ekangaki, considered as the all-time political godfather of Nguti, retired from active politics in the early 1990s, and after his political successor Dr. Simon Munzo betrayed, that is in quotes, his masters in the nation's capital Yaoundé during the turbulent years of the advent of multi-party democracy in the early 1990s. But who exactly is Okie Johnson? Though have the details or have his profile in today's edition of the Median newspaper. Then the Median newspaper again is very much interested in the Anglophone crisis and tells us that government should seek solutions and not scapegoats. You have that is Reverend Nyamsoko Ninko, PCC moderator emeritus, who is talking to the Median Post newspaper. And then the Anglophone crisis again, it tells us about Barrister Nico Hale, who undertakes a 10-day peace mission to the northwest region of Cameroon. In today's edition of the Median Post or the Median newspaper, you equally read about Tokyo Yaoundé Corporation, how Japan donates over 7 billion francs CFA for Yupe fish market. The Yupe market is found in Douala, that is in the littoral region of Cameroon. The paper tells us how the grant from the Japanese International Cooperation Agency will be used to boost fishing related activities at the Yupe fishing port in Douala. The details are found on page 6 of today's edition of the Median newspaper. That article brings us to the end of today's edition of the papers. Thanks for watching.